Let me actually start by introducing our three main speakers. And then what I'm going to do is give a very brief overview for about 10 minutes of some of the key issues. And then we can, after the speakers have spoken for about 15 minutes each, open it up, and we very much want to hear from the audience. I just want to note, and it's very important that we do, that we're hosting this public dialogue in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and Heinz Bongatz, their head of the office, is there somewhere at the back. So, and this is about the third in a series of public meetings that we're having on the UN Security Council. So we want to also acknowledge that partnership as well. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in this order. Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who has just taken his seat, was director in the Department of Political Affairs at the United Nations headquarters in New York. So he's an insider in terms of many of these issues. He later became South African ambassador to the United States, and he also served as South Africa's special envoy to Burundi and the country's ambassador to the African Union. So he has vast experience, which we'll be very glad to benefit from. Mr. Linan, second in the line, is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Chinese Embassy in South Africa. He served in the same position in Botswana and Namibia between 2014 and 2018. Mr. Lee holds a bachelor's degree from Beijing Foreign Studies University in English Literature, interestingly, and a master's degree in Public Policy and Management from the London School of Economics, the LSE. Dr. Jens Christian Gedke, last but not least, is the head of the Department for Political Affairs at the German Embassy in South Africa. He joined the German diplomatic service in 2004 and served at the European Commission as well as the United Nations, so he also has the relevant experience. Dr. Gedke holds a doctorate in international economic law and studied law and political science at Munich, Geneva, and Harvard. And I think Tübingen should be there as well, no? Yeah. So you're going to hear from the three speakers, and we'll have a mic for Ambassador Nhlapo, right? Okay, good. So let me just give a very quick and very brief overview of some of the issues from South Africa's UN Security Council role over the last year, which is part of the project that we've been implementing with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. The 5 permanent members of the 15-member UN Security Council, who are mandated to maintain international peace and security, the US, China, Russia, France, and Britain, are seen by critics as a powder keg, accounting for an incredible 70% of arms sales that fuel conflicts around the globe. The Big Five have come to resemble several of the characters in Aesop's fables. So I often compare them. For example, the US is the lion, the king of the jungle that hunts other beasts. China, of course, is the elephant which has big ears. It listens more than it speaks, but it also has a long memory and seems to be trying to acquire enough strength before showing its power. France is like the wolf in sheepskin, which is often fooled by its own shadow, just as in Aesop's fable, into believing that it's bigger than it actually is. Britain, of course, is the sly fox, recalling Lord Palmerston's famous dictum that countries have no permanent interests, no permanent friends or permanent enemies, but permanent interests. So that goes back to the whole idea of perfidious Albion. The games that the UN's P5 play often determine peacekeeping outcomes in Africa and elsewhere in the world, since the Security Council is the only body at the UN that can start or end peacekeeping missions, and it's the only one whose decisions are also binding on all 193 member states. So we in Africa especially where 86% of the UN's peacekeepers are deployed, need to look very carefully at the dynamics of the games that the P5 play. Every effort at reforming the UN Security Council in the last 54 years, since it was expanded from 11 to 15 members in 1965, has failed. The UN's open-ended working group on council reform, set up in 1993, has long been dismissed in New York as the never-ending working group. And the 5 permanent members of the council, of course, still reflect the anachronistic victors of the post-1945 world, so the victors of the Second World War. And while the formal use of the veto power has declined since the end of the Cold War, it's still effectively used in the closed-door consultations of the Security Council, which is where much of its most important decisions are made. And much of the archaic procedures and policies of the Council are well known to the 5 permanent members, who also have privileged access to the Secretariat staff. And they also happen to dominate most of the most important positions in the Secretariat. So a US citizen, for example, is heading politics and peace building. A French national is heading peacekeeping. A Briton is heading humanitarian affairs, and a Chinese is heading economic and social affairs. Often decisions are based on complex and not always visible trade-offs between the P5, which has been worked out over many years. And there are no written records in many of these closed-door consultations. And so the P5 obviously have institutional memory, and they treat the other 10 rotating members as sometimes calling them jokingly tourists, because they're only there for 2 years and then they leave. So Security Council reform is something that we need to look at very carefully, and many people say they want, but I think the P5 are quite happy with the status quo as it is. But there are many that have argued that countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Germany, Japan, perhaps should come onto an expanded council, but there is no consensus. South Africa is currently serving a 2-year term as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and it served 2 terms in 2007 and 2008, and 2011 and 2012. This year, South Africa's priorities have been the African agenda and seeking to draft more Security Council resolutions and pushing for closer cooperation between the UN and African regional bodies. It's deployed around 1,200 troops in peacekeeping missions in DRC, Darfur, and South Sudan, and about 90% of these peacekeepers are actually in the Congo. And I want to acknowledge General Mbwebi, who is one of South Africa's finest policy intellectuals, and also was the force commander in Burundi and also in the DRC. So, General, please, I just want to acknowledge your presence with us, and we're very glad you could come. South Africa also supported the Silencing the Guns in Africa debate in February. On peacekeeping, during Indonesian-led debates in May on improving the training and safety of peacekeepers, South Africa joined China and Russia in insisting on the centrality of the UN Special Committee on Peacekeeping. In January, South Africa also took a strong line over the DRC election, even as France and Belgium were critical of the electoral process. South Africa, along with China and Moscow, insisted that this be treated as an internal issue. And you'll hear more details maybe from Ambassador Nhlapo, who knows this dossier inside out. In neighboring Burundi, where South Africa played a praiseworthy peacemaking and peacekeeping role between 1999 and 2006, and Ambassador Nhlapo was the special envoy of South Africa, as I said, to Burundi. More recently, South Africa has played a more low-key and cautious role, arguing, along with Moscow, that this must be treated as an internal issue. The April revolution in Sudan that toppled the three-decade autocracy of Omar al-Bashir focused council attention on peacekeeping in Darfur and South Sudan, where South Africa has troops deployed. And while Western powers on the council, the US, France, Britain, Germany, and Belgium, expressed caution in reducing UN peacekeepers in Darfur, South Africa, along with Russia, China, and Indonesia, argued that the Sudanese protests are an internal affair and that the improved security situation in Darfur should be the only criterion to guide the reduction of troops. Further afield, South Africa also insisted on making its voice heard on issues beyond Africa. So it took a very tough stance on Venezuela, siding with Moscow and Beijing in refusing to support what it saw as Washington's regime change agenda on the basis that this approach was unconstitutional and that the issue was strictly internal. And South Africa further criticized what it saw as America's politicization of humanitarian assistance in Venezuela, arguing that the UN should be allowed to basically oversee the process. As South Africa is preparing to chair the Security Council next month in October, some of the themes that it's going to focus on, three main ones, and Ambassador Nhlapo will go into more detail: women and security, relations between the UN and African regional organizations, which it has always consistently focused on. And then the other issue is an open debate on the Middle East, which will look at the Palestinian question. South Africa, in my view, should adopt an approach of three concentric circles in pursuing its interests on the Council. First of all, it needs to work closely with the two other African countries, Cote d'Ivoire and Equatorial Guinea. The second circle should then be the courting of the great powers. So using its BRICS alliance, working with Russia and China, and where it can, also working with Western powers, the P3 of the US, Britain, and France. And the third circle will be basically regional powers, your Germany and Indonesia. And both countries have actually grabbed the pen from the P5 and are drafting Security Council resolutions, which is not something that has happened often in the past. So this public dialogue today examines South Africa's interactions with the great powers, as well as its engagement with important non-permanent regional powers like Germany, and the role of China, which during its November 2018 presidency had an open debate on the issue of strengthening peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping in Africa. Those are the issues we're going to focus on today. So Ambassador Nhlapo, you have the floor as the lead speaker. Try to, if you can, keep to 15 minutes. It's hard to constrain diplomats to 15 minutes, but we have to try.
I'm naturally a rebellious character, but I'll do the best I can. Let me first thank you for giving us this opportunity to have this kind of discussion, particularly at this time when the United Nations is sitting, because I think it will help in clarifying a number of issues. Because unfortunately, if there's any media here, I think I'll mention it. That unfortunately in this country, we've got a media that has got a blind spot to facts. There are certain things that they just don't seem to see. And there are certain things that they rely on other people, other sources, to interpret the very policies and actions of the South African government. And at times we ourselves get puzzled as to where this information comes from and what is the actual role that the media is playing in certain cases. And some of us, we were forced from experience to take a critical view of some of the things that have been happening because they kept on being repeated. And to some extent, they create an impression that these are policy positions or this is the truth. So I think that is a part of the importance of the meeting that we are having today. Let me also welcome our friends and colleagues here from the Chinese and German embassies, the deputy heads of mission, very important people in any embassy, by the way. I'm not flattering them, I'm telling the truth. I've been an ambassador, I know what number twos are capable of. So when they're here, I know that there's power that has been displayed, that has been deployed. I wouldn't take them lightly. But thank you for joining us also. Let me also underscore that we've got very good relations with both countries, as in many, which for us defines our approach towards multilateralism, amongst other things. Our strength depends on our bilateral relations. Within the multilateral space, because that's where you are able to engage the partners that you have in a number of areas in order to find consensus even with very difficult issues, because we've been able to overcome that at a bilateral level. And we've done that with many countries. So that is part of the strength that we use. But we also use part of our history and achievements that we've made in order to do some of the things that we've been able to do. And sometimes being said that we're punching above our weight. In boxing, that would not be allowed, but and we observe the boxing rule. We just use that experience, that comparative advantage, to occupy the space that the opportunity allows us to do so. Like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because of the fact that we got rid of nuclear weapons, we have an advantage. On small arms and landmines, same thing. So it's a comparative advantage of the actions that we've taken that gives us the advantage to take the space that we're occupying. On the 8th of June 2018, South Africa was elected to serve on the UN Security Council for 2-year period, 2019 to 2020, as it's been indicated, having received 183 votes from UN member states voting in the General Assembly. We voted into the Security Council. It's an important element of the legitimacy of South Africa's participation in the Security Council because of the vote that we got. This is South Africa's third term of the Council, having previously served from 2007 to 2008 and from 2011 to 2012. Significantly, South Africa's third term coincides with South Africa's chairship of the African Union in 2020. And that gives us a particular advantage, but also it becomes some challenge. It also coincides with the final period of the African Union's goal of silencing the guns by 2020. This has been an important aspiration of the African continent as a prerequisite for development. Levering South Africa's seat on the UN Security Council to this end reinforces the need for South Africa to play a leading role on African issues on the agenda of Council. In addition to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, China, France, Russia, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, South Africa is one of the 10 elected members. Belgium, Cote d'Ivoire, Dominican Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Germany, Indonesia, Kuwait, Peru, and Poland, serving for a 2-year period. The E10, as it is called, serving only 2 consecutive years on the council, has emerged as a significant player, given its dynamism and willingness to make an impact in the limited period it has on the council. Prior to taking up a seat on the council in November 2018, South Africa hosted an E10 cooperation conference in Pretoria in collaboration with the Embassy of Sweden. The conference brought together both current and incoming E10 members from their capitals and New York for the first time to map up ways to take E10 cooperation forward, particularly to overcome the structural limitations of the Council. And this was quite clear, having analyzed the balance of forces and the current challenges that is facing the Security Council because of global tensions and global politics. It became necessary to ensure that before we get in there, all of us can be able to think together and find better ways of ensuring that there can be an impact in the work that we do in the Council. South Africa's theme for its term is continuing the legacy, working for a just and peaceful world. This resonates with the legacy of President Nelson Mandela, whose values and commitment to peace were commemorated in 2018 during the centenary of his birth. The theme also reflects the intention to build the legacy of the first 2 terms that the country served on the Security Council, as indicated 2007, 2008, 2011, 2012. Since it assumed its seat in January, South Africa is using its tenure on the Security Council to promote the maintenance of international peace and security by advocating for the peaceful settlement of dispute and inclusive dialogue. In this regard, South Africa has endeavored to play a leading role in African issues discussed by the Security Council, as well as maintaining a principled position on issues outside the continent, including the possibility of playing a bridge builder role. Somebody has warned that if you try to play that role, everybody will walk over you and you will remain a mess. So we are very cautious about this bridge builder role, but we believe it is important to do that because we've got possibility of reaching to everybody. South Africa continues to encourage closer cooperation between the United Nations Security Council and other regional and sub-regional organizations, particularly the African Union. We further emphasize the role of women in the resolution of conflicts. In this regard, South Africa continues to argue for a gender perspective to be mainstreamed in all Security Council resolutions in line with Security Council Resolution 1325 of 2000 on women, peace, and security. At the end of 2019, South Africa completed its first 6 months of its 24-month term as an elected member of the United Nations Security Council. During this initial period, South Africa has had to grapple with contentious and complex issues on the agenda of the Council, such as the outcome of the democratic handover of power in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which South Africa played a key role in steering the Council's response on. It also had to consider the inclusion of the situation in Venezuela on the Council's agenda. Furthermore, South Africa had to contribute to the Council response to long-standing issues such as Western Sahara, Palestine, the protected and deadly conflicts in Syria and Yemen, as well as the drawdown of the UN's mission in Darfur, which is led by one of our own, Ambassador Mamabolo. In Somalia, as well as the complications arising from the new crisis, such as in Khartoum, and the flaring up of military conflict in Libya. Do you still have some time?
Yeah, you still have like 5 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah, you're doing very well.
Furthermore, During the initial period, South Africa engaged on a number of important thematic areas, including debates on women, peace and security, the impact of climate change on peace and security, the impact of mercenary groups on peace and security. Of course, we have produced some of the most notorious ones that keep on hibernating and emerging in some places, like in South Sudan recently. So we still have a challenge to deal with issues of that nature. Transitional organized crime at sea, silencing the guns in Africa by 2020, countering terrorism, cooperation between the UN regional organizations, such as the EU, the League of Arab States, international humanitarian law, sexual violence as a weapon in conflict, and the strengthening of UN peacekeeping missions. Overall, during the first 6 months of South Africa's term, Council has held over 196 meetings on all of its agenda items. Additionally, there have been almost daily meetings of the Council's 19 subsidiary bodies, as well as expert meetings. South Africa participated in all of these meetings, including the delivery of statements. During this period, the Security Council has adopted 29 resolutions, 5 presidential statements, and 37 statements. South Africa supported all presidential statements and press statements. We voted in favor of 27 of the 29 resolutions, abstaining on resolutions pertaining to Western Sahara and on sanctions on South Sudan. The element about the Western Sahara is the resistance to include the question of the investigation of human rights in the Western Sahara as part of the mandate of the UN mission. And we've been insisting, like the rest of the continent, that that must be included. But there's been resistance to that. So we vote for the continuation of the existence of the mission, but abstain of the mission, but abstain on the resolution precisely for that issue so that we can be able to make the point, and our statement on our vote has clarified that matter. South Sudan, I think, is also maybe obvious. If it's not, I'll answer the question if it arises. South Africa voted against a resolution tabled by the United States on the situation in Venezuela, which was not adopted due to 2 votes by Russia and China. South Africa will preside over the Security Council in October 2019. The Presidency of Council allows English alphabetical order. South Africa's presidency will follow Russia's September 2019, which is now, and precede that of the United Kingdom. Already we've had discussions with the UK on how we're going to cooperate and make sure that whatever we do, what remains, how do we follow up? The ambassador to the UN came here and there were bilateral discussions on how we can work together, including that period of succession. South Africa will preside over the security, as I mentioned that. South Africa's presidency will be an opportunity to advance its objectives through the holding of high-level open debates in line with South Africa's priorities. Accordingly, South Africa's presidency will focus on conflicts in Africa, UN-AU cooperation, and the flagship debate on women, peace, and security. And of course, if Council agrees and we all come towards a common understanding, there's a likelihood that we might lead a delegation of the Security Council to the AU Peace and Security Council to discuss conflict situations on the continent. Much of the Council's program of work is predetermined by reporting cycles and mandate renewals. that South Africa has limited influence in scheduling additional meetings on the Council program of work. The other issues, I think, are the issues that I think Ade had mentioned. I'll just broach a few.
Now you've run out of time, Ambassador, so just very quickly.
Well, let me just mention them. It's Libya, it's Haiti, it's South Sudan and Sudan, Western Sahara, and Darfur.
Okay, so we're now going to have the Chinese Deputy Ambassador, Li Nan. Your name is actually very close to the tennis player who is more famous than you, Li Na, who won the French Open. But Li Nan is the Deputy Ambassador of China to South Africa. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ceremony, Professor, and thank you very much for a very kind introduction. And also, I think we must thank Ambassador Nhlapo's very nice presentation to us. Actually, Ambassador has been following the situation even more closely than I do. Thank you very much. And before I start, I think according to Chair Professor's metaphor of China like an elephant, I do like that. China is big, so it's like an elephant, but China is peaceful. So that's thank you. So okay, dear friends and ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for inviting us to be here today. And Ambassador himself actually is supposed to be here, but is engaged in another function, so I'm here on his behalf. So I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you my views and suggestions on the current international situation and the strengthening of cooperation under the framework of the United Nations and the Security Council. So as we all know, the United Nations is the outcome of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War, and it is the most representative and authoritative international organization, as well as the symbol of multilateralism and the core of international multilateral mechanism. It bears the ardent expectations of the people of the world for peace and development. Over the past 74 years, based on the three pillars of peace and security, development, and human rights, the United Nations has played an irreplaceable role in promoting human progress. So in today's world, multipolarization, economic globalization, social IT application, and cultural diversification are developing profoundly. Geopolitical hotspots are surging endlessly. Terrorism and armed conflicts are still threatening. Risks and challenges of all kinds are lingering. Unilateralism and rising protectionism are severely impacting and challenging the existing international order and global governance system. The world needs a stronger United Nations more than ever. China joined the United Nations in 1945. It was the first founding member state to sign on the UN Charter, which was the recognition of China's huge sacrifice of around 35 million people and great contribution to the Second World War. Over the years, China has firmly supported multilateralism, the authority and role of the United Nations, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, the international system with UN at its core, and the international order based on international law. This is the basic policy China has pursued for a long time. China has become the second largest contributor of UN regular and peacekeeping budget. In 2019, China's contribution to the United Nations rose to 12.01%, and its contribution to peacekeeping funds jumped to 15.22%. It is worth noting that China pays in full and on time about its membership dues and its financial obligations. In 2015, China announced the establishment of a 10-year China UN Peace and Development Fund with $1 billion. And China will continue to fulfill its financial obligations in the coming years. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China has always adhered to the principle of fairness and justice, made decisions on merits of each case, and never put its own interests above fairness and justice. China will never forget that it is our African brothers that helped China restore its legitimate seat in the UN. China's vote in the Security Council will always belong to all developing countries, including Africa, and is committed to safeguarding our common interests. On regional hotspots such as Syria, the Iranian nuclear issue, and African issues, China has always put forward constructive proposals, played a unique role, and pushed for a political settlement of disputes. China contributes more peacekeepers than any other permanent members of the UN Security Council. Over the past 28 years, China has sent over 40,000 peacekeepers to 30 UN peacekeeping operations, and a total of 21 Chinese military and police personnel lost their lives for peacekeeping. At present, China has more than 2,500 personnel on 8 UN peacekeeping missions and has sent 28,000 personnel to escort missions in the Gulf of the Aden and the waters off the Somali coast, providing safety protection for nearly 6,700 Chinese and foreign ships and cargo ships. China takes the lead in achieving the UN Millennium Development Goals. Over the past 40 years, China has lifted nearly 800 million Chinese people out of poverty, accounting for more than 70% of the global total, and has set a good example for the cause of human rights and progress. Since 2006, China has consistently ranked first in the world in terms of its contribution to world economic growth. In the following years, since 2006, China has been contributing over 30% to global economic growth, making new contributions to world development. China has taken an active part in international cooperation on climate change, terrorism, and non-proliferation, earnestly fulfilled its international responsibilities and obligations, and played an important role in addressing common global challenges. China is committed to building a community with shared future for mankind. The core of this thought is to build an open, inclusive, clean, and a beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security, and common prosperity. This thought has been incorporated many times into UN documents. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has also been written into relevant resolutions of the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, and are pushing forward steadily. So, ladies and gentlemen, Africa is the continent with the most number of developing countries and has the greatest potential for development. However, traditional and non-traditional security issues in some parts of Africa are intertwined at present. The challenges of ethnic conflicts, terrorism, cross-border organized crimes, poverty, unemployment, refugees are prominent. The development of collective security mechanism in of the regional organizations, including the African Union, are restricted by factors such as insufficient funds. China has always supported the efforts of African countries and people in pursuing peace, stability, prosperity, and development, and is committed to supporting Africa in achieving lasting peace and independent and sustainable development. China sets up the China-Africa Peace and Security Cooperation Fund and the China-Africa Peace and Security Forum within the framework of Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. push to implement 50 security assistance projects in the areas of joint building of the BRI, social security, UN peacekeeping, and anti-piracy and counterterrorism, and announced to provide assistance for counterterrorism operations in the Sahel region and the joint force building among the 5 Sahel countries. Africa accounts for 70% of the UN Security Council's agenda. China always stands that the UN Security Council should listen more to the views and propositions of African countries, especially the African members of the UN Security Council. China has established a 3+1 coordination mechanism with 3 African members, including South Africa, in the UN Security Council, aiming to maintain close coordination and cooperation on hotspot issues concerning Africa. Just, I think today in New York Times, China, 1+5 African countries, the incumbent and the coming members of the UN Security Council, just concluded a very nice foreign ministers meeting, and they have a very nice discussion about international affairs. So, ladies and gentlemen, since the establishment, the new South Africa has been elected twice as non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, as Ambassador Nhlapo said. During its memberships, South Africa had played an important role in proper settlement of African hotspot issues. South Africa now serves as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for a 3rd time from 2019 to 2020, and will take over the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council next month and assume the rotating presidency of the African Union next year. It is believed that South Africa will play an even greater role in promoting closer cooperation between the UN Security Council and the African Union and jointly maintaining regional peace and stability. China and South Africa are both big developing countries and emerging markets, share broad common interests, and hold same or similar positions in various areas of maintaining world peace, upholding fairness and justice, and promoting common development. The 2 countries have always understood and supported each other on issues of core interests and major concerns, and determined to safeguard the common interests of the developing countries. China is ready to work with South Africa and other parties to advance cooperation in the following 5 areas within the UN framework. First, we should work together to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and resolutely uphold the authority of the UN, especially the international system with the UN as its core and the international order underpinned by international law. Second, we should jointly defend multilateralism, promote economic globalization with features of being open, inclusive, mutually beneficial, balanced, and win-win results. Support the multilateral trade system, firmly oppose hegemonism, unilateralism, trade bullying, and protectionism. Promote the reform of global economic governance, increase the representation and voice of the emerging markets and developing countries. We should work to address the imbalance of North-South development and promote world economic growth. Third, we should jointly support Africa in solving development problems. We should push BRI to dock with the AU 2063 Agenda and the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Increase investment in infrastructure construction, agriculture, healthcare, education, economy in Africa, and help Africa to eliminate poverty, develop the economy, and improve people's livelihood. Fourth, we should jointly support...
Please try to round up.
Okay.
I know you only have 2 points left.
Okay. Jointly support Africa's capacity building in peace and security. We should push the UN Security Council to strengthen communication and coordination with the AU Peace and Security Council. Support the AU to play a greater role in maintaining peace and security in Africa, support African countries to solve African problems in African way, and advocate peaceful resolution of conflicts through mediation and political dialogue. Last point, fifth, we should coordinately promote the necessary and comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council, aiming to improve its authority, efficiency, and representation. China supports all UN member states to carry out democratic consultations on the 5 major issues, namely the categories, the veto issue, the allocation of regional seats, the size and working methods of the of the Security Council, and the relationship between the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, so as to seek a package solution and reach broadest consensus and ensure the reformed Security Council could play an even more important role and a constructive role in maintaining international peace and security. For that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think the Deputy Chief has shown that diplomats can actually talk in 15 minutes. So, Dr. Ketke, we're going from a great power in the East to a great power in the West. So, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor. I will try to be short and snappy. Thanks also for having me here, and I convey the best wishes from Ambassador Martin Schäfer, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, but I'm happy that you invited me on his behalf. You call the Chinese the elephants. You refer to South Africa, Germany, and the other E10 as the tourists. I'm on the Security Council. I'm not sure whether I share that view, but we are trying hard. We're working hard to change that impression. That's for sure. I thought I explain maybe briefly where we come from as Germans. We are very strongly committed to multilateralism. As you probably know, we have learned the lessons from our past, from our troubled past, never go at it alone again. That has worked well for us in Germany and in Europe in the past 70 years. The European Union is maybe the best example for it. But also, of course, we have a very strong commitment to international institutions and the United Nations in particular. We recognize a trend that multilateralism is coming under pressure from many sides. Populism is on the rise, also in Europe. Power play is back, it seems. Thinking in national terms is gaining strength again and increasing. It's true that multilateral solutions take time, but they enable fair and long-lasting solution. Our foreign minister, the German foreign minister Maas, said yesterday in the opening session of the General Assembly that multilateral foreign policy is sustainable foreign policy. And I think that's our basic approach, and we definitely remain committed to that. That is why we have created what we call an Alliance for Multilateralism, which is an informal network of countries which are united in their conviction that a rules-based multilateral order is the only guarantee for international stability and peace. We are happy that South Africa is one of the countries who shares this commitment. The idea of the alliance is actually to renew the global commitment to multilateralism by pursuing 3 objectives. First, to protect and preserve international norms, agreements, and institutions that are under pressure. Second, to pursue a more proactive agenda in policy areas that lack effective governance and where new challenges require collective action, for instance, such as lethal autonomous weapons, a very pressing issue. And third, to advance reforms in order to make international institutions more inclusive and effective in delivering tangible results, such as the Security Council, for instance, where we support reform, but also other institutions such as the WTO. The UN General Assembly's opening week is, of course, a great opportunity to bring the alliance together. Together with France, we have organized an event which is taking place actually right now at 11 o'clock New York time. And it brought together more than 50 foreign ministers from all continents. And also the South African Foreign Minister Pandor was also scheduled to attend this meeting. We think that this shows that the Alliance for Multilateralism is growing, and with it, the support within the membership of the UN. It is with this strong commitment to multilateralism that we have also taken up our seat, our 2-year seat as a non-permanent member at the Security Council at the beginning of the year. I would just like to briefly mention 3 priorities that we pursue on the Security Council during our term. First, just like South Africa, women, peace and security. We have put a particular focus on this topic. Our aim is to improve the protection of women and getting them involved in peace processes to ensure sustainable peacekeeping. The adoption of Resolution 1325, which you referred to earlier, will turn 20 years next year, and we consider this anniversary as an opportunity for the Security Council to pay more attention to this topic. We welcome and support that South Africa has put the topic high on the agenda and that there are plans for a resolution during its upcoming presidency in the Security Council in October. Of great importance in this regard is to tackle sexual violence in conflicts more effectively. The international community turned a blind eye to this issue for decades. German Foreign Minister Maas chaired an open debate on the topic last April. The Security Council then adopted Resolution 2467, which will make a contribution to support victims, hold perpetrators accountable, and prevent this kind of, will make a contribution, we hope, to preventing this kind of violence. Second priority, human rights and humanitarian law. It is obvious that the Security Council should take action when, for example, when human rights are coming under systematic pressure. On Germany's initiative, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, briefed the Security Council for the first time. Also, we launched an initiative with our French partners aimed at protecting humanitarian workers. For the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, German Foreign Minister Maas attended a meeting of the Security Council organized by the Polish presidency. He used the opportunity to point at the increasing number of humanitarian crises worldwide and the growing pressure on humanitarian international law. At our signature event, which takes place today in New York, we will therefore launch what we call a call for action to strengthen the respect for international humanitarian law and principled humanitarian action. It is meant as a renewed commitment to implement the Geneva Conventions. And third priority, climate and security. You mentioned it also already. Climate change is an increasing threat to peace and security in many regions of the world. Hurricanes, storms, and floods are growing more frequent. Sea levels are rising. The effects on supplies of food and safe drinking water can destabilize entire regions. We are convinced that it is only by working together, by pooling the knowledge and the capabilities, that countries will be able to find answers. Climate change respects no time limits and no borders. In 2018, Germany established the UN Group of Friends on Climate and Security together with Norway. And we organized an international conference in Berlin in 2019 on climate and security, aimed at increasing the momentum for decisive action. We are now building on this during our membership at the Council towards possibly our next presidency in the Council, which will take place in July 2020. Finally, a few words on the cooperation in the Council. Of course, on all these issues, we work closely with our European partners. We have a special configuration in the Council right now. There are 5 of the 15 member states which are member states of the European Union, namely Poland, Belgium, France, the UK, and Germany. I want to mention especially the cooperation with France and what we did in March and April, which was actually a new thing on the Security Council. It was like a twin presidency. We called it jumelage, a French word. So we combined the presidencies and followed a joint approach, which is something that was very well received, maybe surprisingly well received. This very close collaboration between our countries was seen as by many as a concrete positive example of cooperation at a time when multilateralism is actually under strain. But I'm happy to say that also the cooperation that we enjoy with South Africa is extremely close. We share the commitment to the rules-based multilateral order and to human rights. I've mentioned women, peace and security as a very important topic that we pursue together. And we have close communication channels in New York and also here in Pretoria. The example I already mentioned, women, peace and security, we definitely support the idea of South Africa to put this topic high on the agenda, and there are plans for a resolution in October. Above all, I would like to mention in this regard the regular exchange that we have here as the elected 10 on the Security Council. Pretoria is the only place where we have regular meetings of the E10, and we appreciate that a lot, and that is thanks to the professionalism, I have to say, in DIRCO, in the Foreign Ministry of South Africa. And we greatly enjoy this for us, very fruitful exchange that we have with the other non-permanent members, but of course, especially with the South African colleagues on all the items which are on the agenda of the Security Council. Do I have still 2 minutes, or am I running out of time?
Well, you're out of time, but
Okay.
maybe if you have a final brilliant point, you can
I have a point, but I'm not sure whether it's brilliant. So, just since you mentioned Security Council reform, I worked on that file for 3 years in New York. I liked it, even though there was no progress whatsoever. I think we are 9 years after I left the file. I think there's still not a lot of progress. Nevertheless, our main goal, and we are definitely pursuing a Security Council reform. We think that the structure of the Council needs to reflect the world of the 21st century. It's clear that reform cannot be achieved overnight, but it's been many years, as the professor has pointed out. We work together with partners from Brazil, India, and Japan, as well as many others, but also especially South Africa. And we believe it is high time that we finally move forward. In the meantime, we have made some small progress when it comes to the working methods of the Security Council. For example, to increase the effectiveness of the sessions, briefers are asked to include more practical recommendations on the measures for the Council to embrace. Also, we want to encourage the participation of civil society in Council meetings, in particular women civil society briefers in debates of the Council. We are additionally seeking to make debates more interactive by asking members to keep their intervention short, concise, and avoid reading out written statements. So that is my final sentence. But nevertheless, of course, that should not distract us from the overall ambition, namely to reform the Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mohau. I'm a final year civil engineering student at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. It makes sense for the P5, or whatever you call them, Big Five, to be the permanent members since the 1945 after the World War. It made sense now. It doesn't make sense right now. Right now, it doesn't make no sense. What I'm trying to ask there is that why can't the 5 permanent people be people representing different continents? For instance, Africa, everywhere, where there would be 2 members, 1 permanent, one non-permanent. Because it makes no sense for China and United States to actually be dealing with 70% of the problems in Africa. For me, it makes no sense. So is that possible if we can just lose this thing and start all over again? Maybe?
Good evening. My name is Mbongeni Shabalala. I'm a student here at the university. Um, First of all, I've got a question at hand. The first one is regarding the United Nations Council Security in South Africa. As you know, that South Africa is a member of BRICS, and I wanted to know, since BRICS is initially, like, South Africa is initially pairing with the guys from the east. Then the UN is from the west, and I also acknowledge that China and Russia, they're also involved with the UN. Between our relation, doesn't that affect relations in the UN and South Africa? Because we were members earlier on, then because of certain issues, we dropped from the UN. So I just want to know that, doesn't that affect us in a way? Because like now we seem like we don't have a clear vision as a country of where we're going. You know, because now we kind of like confused with the UN at one hand, at the other end, like with the East. So personally, I'd just say we should like just have like a common vision of where we're going. With either we stand with the East or the West.
Good evening. My name is Chira, that Geographic Environmental Management. I just want to ask a question in terms of, since South Africa is going to be serving in the UN Security Council, and I understand that it is there, it gives an opportunity to work on the African Union goal on silencing the guns by 2020. My question is, in the context of South Africa, since it will be working on the African Union goal, what has been the work so far, and what strategy does South Africa intend to implement in achieving this silencing the goal agenda? Silencing the guns.
Good evening, everyone. Mananga Prosper is my name, a student at this university. My question is, does South Africa serve the interests of Africa in a long run, or it's serving the interests of colonial masters? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor. I think that's a very good ambush, which I've got to get out of it as a general. First of all, let me first thank your good self and the Institute for organizing this, and also the choice of the speakers you have arranged. But Ambassador Nhlapo, you made a point initially in terms of the media when you were coming through, and of course taking to what the institution is doing here today. The question would be, we as South Africans, where we are as government and what we're doing in the world, do the people really know what we're busy doing and why we're doing what we're doing? I think that would be very interesting. So if you want support to move that direction, that would be very critical. And also looking at the issue of, I think we need to look at that, probably you might allude to it, looking at the issue of East Africa and those colleagues of ours and friends of ours in East Africa, Central Africa, especially if you take into account that we're going to move to the AU, and Rwanda, Kigali, has been there before us, and the program they were pushing. Now, as we begin to move towards the Security Council, not only taking into account the Equatorial Guinea, but probably looking at that direction. Of course, is it possible that North, East, and South can at least assist us together? That would be the question. To Mr. Nen Li from China.
Sorry, General, I just want to understand, North, East, and South collaborate in what area?
Now, collaborating in terms of making sure that the Big Five at least does behave and begin to at least be influenced in a positive way in dealing with the conflict in the world. Well,
Mr. Nhlapo, I had an opportunity to command your troops, good troops, and thanks also to provide us with the capabilities which are not commonly available in Africa in terms of soldiering. You gave us doctors, you gave us engineers in Congo. That was at least a privilege and honor to command them. I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you also, among the big five, you are the ones who seemingly are ready to come to Africa and contribute, not only in terms of writing and participating in formulating the mandates, but also not providing the funding, but bringing warm bodies and being ready to be part of the continent in result. So I want to thank you for that, and it's well appreciated. But probably I will say very little on your side, except to say you've got to look at how do you assist us, those who are contributing in terms of funding, that they are also ready to contribute warm bodies, because it is very difficult when they fund the missions and they dictate what we need to do as commanders on the ground, but they don't have the warm bodies who take the punishment, because at the end of the day, somebody is dying on the ground and people are funding the process. So you have made it different, you are coming on board. But I'll leave it at that on your side. Doctor, I appreciate what Germany is doing, and I won't mention where I've been, but I've just come from another environment in Europe. I landed only this morning, where Germany again was leading, and your colleague was in Geneva on Monday. I was having at least a dinner in your embassy there, and the issue is protection of civilians in the areas, in the urban areas where there are bombs falling. And they are talking about protection of civilians. But Germany, you have come on board. Are you looking, except the issue of the Security Council, I think I appreciate also that you are participating in this exercise, and also you have mentioned some of the countries you are working with, which is very good. But are you looking at probably bringing certain capabilities which we don't have in the peacekeeping environment from a military police perspective? Because challenge we are having in terms of technology and the ability to do geolocation, also UAVs, long distances, to be able to cover at least areas where there's jungle, you can't see really what's happening underneath there. So are you able to look at those to assist in this?
Hello, my name is Wilile, and this question is for Dr. James Christian Katre and for Professor Adekeye Adebajo.
I'm the chair.
But I'd also like you to please engage it.
Okay.
Because I think as young people, we've just kind of accepted why South Africa is part of United Nations, but we haven't really critically looked at why are we really part of United Nations. And just now that I'm intrigued by the philosophy of law and why we're part of policies, I think it's very important we as young people start questioning these kind of things, because the aggression on being part of United Nations is very dominant. You can't, when you research about United Nations, it's there, you're part of it. You can't question what is it doing. And for me, what I want to know as a young black woman in South Africa is, why is it so important for South Africa to be part of United Nations, especially in the long run? Thank you.
A lot of questions and difficult ones. Why South Africa should be part of the UN? Maybe you want to say something about that too. I can only comment on that from a German perspective. And from a German perspective, South Africa is a big, important country in the world, and especially in Africa, and has a lot to bring at the table. And when we talk about global problems, I'm just mentioning climate change, which doesn't stop at the border of any country. We need those big players on board to find solutions and to influence others and to bring everyone to the table to find joint solutions. So what I'm saying is, from our perspective, we need South Africa as a partner to find those multilateral solutions. That's why it definitely should be part of the UN. Other questions? Maybe the question from the professor. Yes, we are also pen holders. So we are also drafting, and we enjoy it. Even though it's a difficult exercise. I just mentioned one example where South Africa has been extremely helpful, and it was just last week on a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Syria, namely in Idlib, which unfortunately at the end of the day was not adopted due to vetoes by China and Russia. But South Africa voted along with a great majority of the Council. 12 member states of the Council voted in favor of this resolution. And we thought that is very important, and that was one resolution where we were pen holders together with Belgium and Kuwait. Then the first question, I don't want to be too long, and I can't answer all the questions.
No. You share them anyway.
Yeah. Regarding Security Council reform, and I just I share your view 100%. I think African states need to be permanent members in the permanent category of the Security Council. As you say, the majority of the topics which are dealt with in the Security Council concern Africa, and so we definitely need African countries, African member states in the permanent category. Absolutely.
Can I just ask you a very quick question? You talked about working very closely, Germany, with 4 other EU members in the Security Council. Do you still think you'll have 4 at the end of the year, or 3? Will Britain be still an EU member?
I thought you were referred to other EU member states whose term finishes by the end of the year. So we will not be 5 anymore anyway. And now your question concerns Brexit. That's, of course, a difficult question. Do you have 2 more hours? I've worked on that file before I came here. Well, you know, the deadline for Brexit is 31st of October. There have been extensions before. I am not in a position to say what is going to happen on the 31st or after the 31st. A lot depends on the domestic situation in London. But just know that should there be a request for another extension, also the EU member states, according to Article 50 of the EU treaties, need to unanimously agree on extending the deadline. So it's extremely complicated. I'm really not in position to tell you how it's going.
And I think it would be undiplomatic to stick your neck out.
Okay.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. For the issues, I think first of all, I want to make one point very clear. That is, South Africa is the most powerful nation on this continent, and wherever.
You know I'm Nigerian.
No problem. Yeah. Here, do what the Romans do. Okay. I do believe that, you know, as a very, very responsible member nation on this continent, South Africa has a very great role to play, either regionally or continentally on this continent. And wherever the UN Security Council reform goes, I believe South Africa, maybe as some other big nations, really deserves a place in the UN Security Council. That is my belief. And the second, I want to touch upon the issue of the first questioner. That is, where will the reform go in terms of the permanent membership? I think for the current structure of UN Security Council, I think is the legacy of history. You know, you cannot distance from history before you start imagining something else. But of course, as my colleague mentioned, as the world is moving on, something must happen, you know, to reflect the reality of the international situation. It's totally understandable. But whether, you know, we should pursue whether every continent must deserve 1 or 2 places in the UN Security Council, as I think it's open to discussion. Because now, currently, African continent, because of the historical injustice imposed upon it, and I think it needs to, you know, have more representation in the UN Security Council. For the other continent, even in Southern American continent, There's no one yet. So this is a very complicated issue, but everybody is looking to deep into the options on how to move forward. I think it's open for. I don't want to come for that for details, but as I believed, China believes we need more representation of the developing nations, including Africa especially. That's our position. And certainly, I think for the role of how to coordinate this relationship between United Nations and AU, that is something I think I have discussed with our colleagues in Durko about, how to further coordinate and strengthen the cooperation between AU Security Council and the UN Security Council. A lot of hotspot issues currently going on this continent, like in Sudan and some other places. I think for that, our position is very clear. We really, really want to support the two organizations, working very, very closely with each other in terms of fund allocation and something else, this kind of stuff. More than 70% of issues discussed in the UN Security Council are related to African affairs. So we always believe we must we must support the African solutions to African problems in an African way. So and in terms of that, not only like General mentioned, China has not only contributed personnel and funding to the peacekeeping missions in Africa, but also I think we are doing what we can to improve and to empower the capability of Africa to deal with some of the hotspot issues. For example, we have supported the development of the African standby force and the African capacity for immediate response to crisis, so on and so forth. But we're supporting in our capacity. Sometimes it needs time to happen, but it's our idea. It is that, and for the peace cooperation, peacekeeping missions on this continent, one of the questioners mentioned, it's not only China and America and some others are dealing with the peacekeeping missions here. Actually, it's the whole UN Security Council. We are working as a group, as an important international organization. We are carrying out our duties and obligations together. But whether is there any improvement we must find, I think we can work on that always and find a better way to do it more efficiently and to make things solved as soon as possible. But that's the direction we're moving on. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me start with the first question. There's a reality of the diminishing monopoly of the P5 on certain issues. If you look at the election of the last Secretary General, the one that we have now, it was not the P5 that ultimately determined who should be recommended to the United Nations General Assembly for election. The process was open. All the candidates had to present. There are several candidates. They presented themselves explaining to the membership of the UN what is it that they will do. Something that has happened for the first time. And I think this is something that we should laud, because that has been something that has been pushed for some time, that let the General Assembly take the responsibility. Because ultimately, it is the whole membership of the UN that votes in the Secretary General. We don't want a disaster that becomes a choice of a compromise because of bargaining between members of the P5S who will be the best choice. So I think it's something that has been a breakthrough that we must accept and encourage. And I'm sure in many other areas we'll have such breakthroughs. There cannot be any resistance for too long or forever, because even the P5 itself has to come to a point where they recognize that when it comes to the General Assembly, all members are equal, we've got equal vote. You can't have a sway. And in certain cases, you've got to take into consideration that if you think you can push everybody to the limit, you end up in isolation, and no country wants to be isolated in this international atmosphere. It's a very painful thing to happen. Some countries don't care. So I think that for me, it's important these things are beginning to happen. There's another question that has been asked. Maybe let's debunk this. The UN is not a Western institution. It's an international institution involving all nations, established for the purpose of ensuring that never again shall be another war. That was the purpose for the establishing of the United Nations. And as the charter, the first sentence in the charter indicates, says, we, the people of the United Nations. It doesn't say we, the P5, or we, the countries of the United States. It says we, the people of the United Nations. And I think gradually what we see happening with the involvement of civil society and opening up of the structures and discussions of the United Nations, we are beginning to have the people of the United Nations beginning to speak. On climate change, it is the people of the United Nations. The people are the ones who are speaking more louder, saying to their governments, it's about time that you move away from certain positions. This is what we want, and we want it now. From 8-year-olds to, I don't know. I think these are some of the openings that we should be able to appreciate and encourage. And I think the Secretary General is doing a good job on these things. Silencing the guns by 2020, there is a structure of the AU formally that is supposed to coordinate that. But what you can do, and what we're doing in South Africa, is to encourage the regional bodies that are dealing with particular conflicts to begin to find peaceful solution to those conflicts. And wherever possible, we avail ourselves, and we've made a contribution to that extent. And that's what is meant by silencing the guns. Even our own civil society structures are involved in negotiations, in peace negotiations, out in the field, in conflict zones, trying to promote peace in very concrete terms in the Central African Republic, in the Sudan, in South Sudan. So you do have South Africans on the ground. We do have South African forces also contributing towards the stabilization of unstable and violent environments. Does South Africa serve the interests of Africa or the interests of colonial master? I'm not sure who's South Africa's colonial master. There is no way you can serve anybody's interest. First, we've got our own interest as a nation. Like every other country, our national interest is a priority to us. Our people is our priority. The well-being and welfare of our people, as our constitution says, that is our priority. The weaknesses in government and the failures that we've seen, notwithstanding, does not remove the fact that that is a priority. There's no colonial master that we can serve. There isn't. So I think let's debunk that notion that even in the Security Council or elsewhere, we serve the interests of other nations. In many cases, we get into trouble because we stand on our ground on principle in what we believe in, even if we make mistakes. But at least we do take a stand. We don't keep quiet and wallow away and be afraid of anybody. Everyone knows where we stand on every issue. That's what is important. We declare, and if we don't have a common basis, we try to negotiate. If we can't agree, We agree to disagree, but continue engagement. That has always been our approach. So for us, there is no bigger power when it comes to common interest and peaceful resolution of conflicts and engagement. General, do the people know what you are doing? Not necessarily. The media is not doing its part, and I'm not sure if it is the responsibility of the media to do so. The media should be carrying the message from government. There should be more outreach from government to explain our foreign policy objectives to our own people, like any government does. There's a huge budget in DIRCO which has to be utilized for that purpose. Engage the youth, engage broadly, so that our people can know. Sometimes we do that through Parliament, by reporting to Parliament what we do. Of course, not everybody takes note, but that is one way of doing it. And that is where the media should also be helpful. But I think the priority rests with government. It is the government that has been elected to represent the people of South Africa in this forum. It is in the name of the people of South Africa that we speak. If that flag is there, I don't speak on my behalf. You speak on behalf of the people of South Africa if you sit behind that flag. And whatever you say and do, you have to be accountable to the people of South Africa. I think that time has come and we should be doing more of that. I think the other questions that you have asked, General, as to how does Africa give direction to the rest of the world in terms of what should happen on the continent. I think Africa should take the first step in beginning to deal with its own problems, because some of them we created. We have to deal with this, find the solutions to those problems. There have been proposals as to how best we can be able to do so. It cannot be that 90% of the budget for peace and security on the continent comes from the donor countries. And the Africans are not paying. And therefore, if you come to me and you want my money, I'll tell you where it must go. And this is what is happening. This is what Africa has been debating in terms of the reforms. There's been some resistance in certain quarters, but I think the fact that the matter is on the agenda, we need to pursue it vigorously, and we need to contribute financially and otherwise towards implementing even our own decisions. We take decisions and expect other people to pay money and for them to implement them, or for us to do a job out of it. It's not correct. It's just unacceptable. That's why they don't respect us in certain quarters. They will tell us where their money must go, and I think it's a fair deal, because we are not contributing towards the solutions of some of the problems that we create for ourselves.
Okay. Ambassador, have you covered just about...
Well, I think the question of why South Africa is a member of the UN, the colleagues have covered it. We are part of the formation of the United Nations, by the way. South Africa, represented by the Union of South Africa. Even Chance Marts is reported to have been very active in the contribution of the preamble of the United Nations. But the ANC is on record around the same time when the Atlantic Charter was being drawn up, when that meeting was taking place with the African claims, to have placed on record what we think are the interests of Africa. That should be taken into consideration, because Chance Marts was not representing us. Okay. And we came with a lot of proposals, including the bill of, we had the Bill of Rights before the UN, by the way, here in this country. And if you look at that history and the contribution that was made, you can see the impact of trying, as a colonized, oppressed people, to get through to that meeting to which we are not represented, but by smarts, to make our point in terms of what we want for ourselves and want for Africa. Look at the African claims, study them, then you'll understand this country's contribution towards the United Nations and the thinking around some of the principles that came about.
Okay, can I give that to our German colleague?
Yeah, that's a very good and valid question, and I think that's the task to find a way to apply the instruments that the Security Council has at hand for this challenge. Of course, climate change as such, is not directly a Security Council issue. Climate and security, that would be the matter for the Security Council. And we think that we now have to look for ways, how do we bring the Security Council into this area and apply the instruments that it has. I think that's a task that we all have to somehow master. And we are probably pretty much at the beginning. But we're definitely ready to work on it.